Germany's Finance Minister Christian Lindner has made a surprise visit to Kyiv to hold political talks. His visit comes amid a debate over Ukraine's demands for Germany to supply Taurus cruise missiles. Lindner said Germany had already provided more than €1.5 billion in direct financial aid to Ukraine since the start of the war and pledged that Kyiv could count on more financial support. Lindner is leader of the Free Democrats, one of Germany's three ruling coalition parties, and a reserve Air Force officer. His budgets have massively increased Germany's military spending. As he arrived in Kyiv, the finance minister said Ukraine was attacked by Russia because it chose the path of civil society and democracy.
Ich bin zuletzt Anfang des Jahres 2020 in Kiew gewesen.
I was last in Kiev early in 2020 and held extensive talks with representatives of government, opposition, civil society and business. At that time, I got to know a society, a country that had decided to turn towards democracy, towards a market economy, towards the political West and its values. I am convinced that Ukraine was attacked by Russia also because it had opted for the community of liberal democracies and against the authoritarianism of Putin. It was attacked because it wants to overcome oligarch capitalism and establish a stronger market economy. It was attacked because it opted for an open society.
DW's Matthias Böllinger is there for us. Tell us more about Lindner's mission in Kyiv.
So he's the first minister in months to arrive here. If last year people were rushing and basically passing from one to each other, visiting here for the last few months, it's been a little bit calmer. However, Lindner is, of course, an important guest because Germany is the second biggest donor of Ukraine, and there's a lot of things that a finance minister from Germany has to discuss with its counterpart in Kyiv. That's his program, that's his mission, his official mission, but of course people will be watching something else. People will be watching whether he's conveying a message from the Chancellor, from the government, about the delivery of Taurus missiles, cruise missiles that Ukraine has requested from Germany and that Germany has so far been reluctant to deliver.
Stay with us for a moment, Matthias. I'd like to ask you about this next report you filed for us, because as Ukraine continues to call for more advanced weapons, this 21st century war is still being waged largely with 20th century equipment. Ukrainian crews still rely on old Soviet-era vehicles while they wait for Western tanks to arrive. Matthias took a look at how one Ukrainian tank crew is coping.
This is Ukraine's standard tank. It's an old Soviet model, the T-64. Although they jokingly ask TV crews from Germany if they have brought a more modern Leopard tank with them, this is what they have.
They're doing their job. It's not as if we had a choice. We're using what we've got.
Soldiers begin basic maintenance as soon as a tank returns from a mission. These are the luckier ones. The platoon has lost half of its tanks since the war started. You can see months of fighting engraved here in the body of this tank.
This one has taken a few scratches. The important thing is that the armor is restored. See, here is a little hole. All this was gone. But they replaced it, and we are ready to go again.
These Soviet-era tanks are much lighter than their new Western counterparts. That makes them more agile, but leaves the crew less protected. Key to the Soviet design is an automatic loading system. It means they can reload fast, but it's a danger. If the tank is hit, the ammunition can explode in the cabin, killing everyone inside. That weakness has been a problem for the Russians, who have similar tanks. Western anti-tank weapons killed many crews by blowing up the cabin.
Javelins and NLAWs are a frightening thing. Of course, you also need to hit the target and know how to use them. But anyway, the Russians don't have them.
That's why the Ukrainians still value the T-64. It was developed in the 1960s in Kharkiv. It is, they say, adequate to meet the Russians. Ukraine's fleet was left over when the Soviet Empire collapsed, and while a number of newer Western tanks like the Leopard have arrived at Ukraine's front lines, for many battalions the T-64 is still the standard battle tank. But it has significant problems. One of the biggest, the engine overheats quickly. In summer, even a short trip can be too much. With no Leopards in sight, their hope is to take tanks from the Russians, war trophies. The ones they use are similar, but a bit newer. The successor model, the T-72.
I prefer the trophy tanks. They are faster, they're newer, they don't break down as often. We can just drive and do our job. There were times when we could do 3 sorties in one day. Drive out, hit the enemy, come back, recharge, and drive out again.
There's a trophy here, hidden in the bushes. You can still see the letter Z, symbol of the Russian aggression. But this tank is now ready to fight for Ukraine.
Matthias, would this war be over much quicker if Ukraine were better equipped?
Well, it would most likely be over much quicker if Ukraine was better equipped, but it would also probably be much easier for Ukraine to throw back the Russians or to break through the lines if they had been given the tanks, the Western tanks, the Leopard tanks. A few months earlier, it took quite a while for especially the German government, but also the Americans, to decide on this, and that was time that the Russians used to build fortifications, to lay out mines, and these are exactly the problems that they're encountering now at these parts of the front where they have the Leopards. So it's not only the technology, it's also the timing.
Yeah, there was so much political back and forth and all in public view. What about the delivery of Taurus cruise missiles, the latest in this saga?
It's similar. The British and the French started delivering cruise missiles that have a longer range, and that's when the discussion in Germany took off, when the Germans started discussing it. Then they tied. That was never an official position, but this is what we have heard from the German government, from people who know the matter. They have tied their decision to the American decision delivering ATACMS. That's the American equivalent to the Taurus that can strike up to 300 kilometers. That means far behind the lines. And in the last few days, there have been rumors that Germany might be moving on this issue, but we haven't heard anything. The Taurus would, of course, not only stock up the possibilities of Ukraine in numbers of missiles available besides the Storm Shadows of Britain, for example, but it also has a few properties that make it more effective in certain contexts than the Storm Shadows. It is said to be much more effective if you, for example, strike at bridges, and bridges are one of the main targets. Just remember the Kerch Bridge that connects Crimea with Russia. It's one of the main targets of Ukraine in this longer range.
Matthias, what do the soldiers you met, for example, think about the extent of support from abroad?
Well, most soldiers I met, unlike in the beginning of the war when I heard that people have been very unhappy about Germany's hesitance, that was before Germany started to deliver any bigger equipment at all. People are grateful for the support that they are getting, but it's very clear at the front lines that this equipment is never enough, because Russia is, in terms of sheer numbers of equipment, one of the biggest armies in the world, and they always have a lot more to throw against them in terms of ammunition, in terms of tanks, in terms of artillery. And though Ukraine prides itself to be a little bit better in tactics, losing less equipment, that never matches that. That's why there's a constant need for more, especially ammunition, much more even than tanks.
So where would you say Ukraine is at in its counteroffensive now?
So over the weekend, we've seen a few advances by Ukraine. Now, Russia has, I've mentioned it before, this very heavily fortified and mined main defense line, and then two other defense lines behind. And Ukraine would need to break through this main defense line and then probably through the other two as well, hoping that it would create some kind of a moment where the front reorganizes and where they could push through. For now, they haven't. They have reached this main defense line, or they're close to it, but they haven't broken through. And whether this will be possible or not will depend on equipment, on tactical success. And that's the big question that people are watching now. It's too early to say, because it needs a lot of preparation in terms of hitting artillery positions, etc. But this is what everybody is waiting for.
The analysis there on the war in Ukraine from our Kyiv correspondent, Matthias Bollinger. Thank you.
So let's look at the politics behind supplying Ukraine with weapons. Professor Phillips O'Brien is Professor of Strategic Studies at the School of International Relations at St Andrews University in Scotland. Welcome to DW. Even with Western-supplied weapons, is Ukraine being outgunned at the moment?
It's not. It's a question of has Ukraine been given the right things that it needs to take back its territory? It was given, your story just talked about access to Western armored fighting vehicles over the summer and Western artillery and MLRS systems, but with specific range limitations. It was if Ukraine was given weapons to make this head-on assault, but making head-on assaults is really hard in this war. I mean, tanks, as we've seen, can be destroyed or disabled by a huge number of issues. What Ukraine was not given until very recently, starting with the British Storm Shadows, was the ability to hit the Russians at range, to hit their depots, to hit their logistics. That was a big mistake, because it means that Ukraine was forced to begin with these heads-on assaults. Hopefully, going forward, the range issue will be made up, and Ukraine will be given more of what it actually needs.
OK, and part of that range issue is the use of cruise missiles. And Germany is currently debating the possibility of providing Ukraine with Taurus cruise missiles. They have a range almost double those provided by France and the UK. Part of that discussion is about limiting the weapons so they can't hit targets in Russia. So does this hint at German distrust of Ukraine?
I mean, you can tell. My understanding of the German government, and I'm sure your viewers know as much as I do on that, is that what they don't want to do is have a German weapon hit on Russian territory. That would be considered to be a form of escalation the German government wishes not to see. The real problematic issue, and by the way, the one that you might say the American administration has been wrestling with when it comes to the well-known ATACMS for the HIMARS MLRS system, is do you want to give a lot of systems that Ukraine can use to hit in Crimea, which is part of Ukraine, legally part of Ukraine, but which seems to have a certain talismanic idea for Putin and the Russian regime. So that seems to be the real limitation guidance. I mean, right now, Ukraine can hit inside of Russia with the missiles it's gotten from the UK and France. I mean, it is actually on the border with Russia for a lot of places up around Kyiv, Sumy. It can launch into Russia if it wants to. It chooses not to launch these Western systems into Ukraine. So I'm not into Russia. I don't think it's so much will they attack Russia. The question is, do you want to give Ukraine the systems it needs to attack Crimea?
So give us an idea then of lead times from request through discussion, refusal, acceptance agreement, and ultimately to deployment of these tanks or weapons?
Well, it depends very much on the system. I mean, one thing that is shown at is that during peacetime, there's an assumption of how long it takes to do something. And when war comes about, these things get truncated. They get shortened very much. So people were saying, oh, you can't give Ukraine Patriot anti-air missiles because it'll take a year to train the Ukrainians just to use the system. Well, you know, war comes about. And you can train these things in a few months because you really have an accelerated project of training to do that. Now, for something like the F-16, it will take 6 months or so to get it really fully trained and up. When it comes to a cruise missile, though, that can happen very, very quickly. That once the British government made the decision to hand over the Storm Shadows, for interesting, they were in play within, I don't want to say days, but more like weeks or months, and not more than 1 or 2 months to get them up and running. So if the Germans, say, wanted to hand over the Taurus missile to the Ukrainians, one assumes that could be up and running in in a few weeks or at most a month or two.
Very interesting. Thanks for joining us, Professor Phillips O'Brien from St Andrews University.